Good afternoon, class. This is John checking in with you. I didn't get quite as far as I'd hoped to today in my comments before I returned your exam, so I wanted to take just a little bit of time here to get us back on track. And as you know, tomorrow we'll have a special guest. President Brandeis is going to be joining us, and we'll be continuing our conversation about the role of our carbon-based energy dependence and what that has meant for the development of politics, particularly in the past 200 years or so. So tomorrow we'll be wrestling with the Ludlow massacre, and that's going to be an important moment in the political and really the politically violent early 20th century. And the United States has an interesting labor history. And as we'll see, our labor history and our energy history have, in many cases, paralleled one another at critical moments during the last 200 years. So here's our objective for today. We started off, we talked about these questions, which incidentally were the questions that were assigned with your reading that you did last night or this past weekend for today. And then I started into some organized lecture comments and was talking a bit about how one of the biggest transitions, and this kind of helps me think of this conceptually because obviously we all know that coal and oil are going to become a more important part of the Western economy starting around 1800 and even a little earlier if you're going back to Great Britain. But one of the conceptual shifts that happens is that energy, which was always, well, for most of world history, was a consequence of solar radiation and largely plant life that was grown by the sun on soil and then converted to energy, either animal energy or human energy, or animal food that was then converted to human energy. Those things change dramatically when we start to see a transition to coal, because coal is going to make it possible for energy to become less constrained by time. You won't have to wait for a new growing season to assemble more energy to drive your energy requirements forward, because now you have this seemingly inexhaustible. Now we all know that coal is exhaustible, but at that time it would have seemed almost limitless. We have this unlimited energy source underground that if we go and unearth it and transport it and burn it, we convert it to energy. And so this is a dramatic transformation, and it has consequences for the way in which Americans settle and the way they go about their daily lives. It makes possible industrialization. And industrialization, we also know, goes alongside with urbanization and the concentration of greater numbers of people in cities. And this is not something we normally think about when we think about energy, but it's the new energy dependence and the new forms of energy that, energy is taking new forms. Those new forms make possible the transitions to urban settlement in all its glory and its disgustingness. Here we have a picture of a stockyard. These are folks working in the meat packing industry. And I talked a little bit in class about machine cities. And one way to think about machine cities is maybe you can think about, I like to use the metaphor of a tomato. And an organic tomato, and when I say organic, I mean think of a tomato as an organism. And most organisms, they are planted, if it's a plant, it is rooted somewhere in the soil, and it falls to that organism, that plant organism, to work hard and battle and fight to get the nutrients out of the soil that it needs to become its best plant organism. So in the case of a tomato, to become the most red, most juicy, there's all sorts of benefits to the tomatoes. Philosophers would say telos. Its desire to become the best example of that which it is capable of becoming. There are advantages from being red, from being juicy, so on and so forth. That's an organic tomato if it has to struggle on its own. Now imagine a different tomato, and this might be like a tomato that you could buy at the grocery store. It's grown in a test tube, in a petri dish, if you will, where it's given the nutrients that the industrial tomato grower thinks a tomato will need so that it can shortcut the process, maybe save some time, save some expenses. It's given artificial UV rays or sun rays. It's given water. That tomato does not have to fight to become the best tomato that it is capable of becoming. It is not an organic tomato because it's been subsidized. It's had things done for it. It's been given certain things. And at the end of the day, when you taste an organic tomato and you taste a store-bought or a test tube tomato, you can taste the difference. It's as if that store-bought tomato doesn't have the character. Well, if that metaphor helps, think of a city now. These machine cities are cities that don't necessarily have to grow and produce their own needs. Because, for example, Chicago, the picture here, Chicago becomes one of the main meat production, we'll call it industrial production centers of the U.S. economy. So Chicago specializes in meat. That means Chicago has to get its other things from other places. But sort of like that test tube and that petri dish, now things are going to be given to Chicago. Chicago is going to focus on its stockyards and its meat slaughter and its meat packing, its meat production. But now it's going to have its other needs met as inputs. Think of them as nutrients being squeezed into the test tube or squeezed into the petri dish. It's a different model for development, but now we're going to see concentration start to happen, just as coal will become concentrated and the energy source of the city will now be rather predictable in many parts of Europe and the United States. These cities are going to become more focused and more machine-oriented, less organic. Cities won't meet all of their own needs. They'll have their needs met by them. I put colonies here because colonies play a critical role in this, because in order to make possible the industrialization and the urbanization that's happening in Europe and the United States, or collectively the West, the raw materials and resources that are being converted by industrialization and by coal energy into finished products, those raw materials are increasingly coming from other parts of the world. Again, very much as test tube squeeze, add cotton, add tobacco, add coffee, beans, add corn, you name it. It's that outside nutrient that the machine city needs that's being added by these faraway places. Again, this is only made possible by the new energy revolution, because it costs a lot of money to bring coffee beans, to bring bananas, to bring cotton, to bring tobacco, you name it, to these city centers. It's all only possible because these dense concentrations of coal and later oil allow this to happen. Okay, so coal and democracy. We've started this conversation. We were talking a little bit about it. It's important to note that in the Western tradition, as much as we celebrate things like democracy and one person, one vote, and representative government, and popular sovereignty and individual rights like freedom of speech, so on and so forth, the beginning of the United States, and this is true of Europe as well, even during its Enlightenment and its liberal values that we've already talked a little bit about in this course, the representative governments that began were actually quite narrow, small clubs of powerful, wealthy people who could influence their governments pretty significantly. It's not until later on in the 1800s that we start to see mass politics emerge. And as Timothy Mitchell is arguing in this book, Carbon Democracy, in this book he's saying, you know what, this stuff happens because of the influence two things. The influence that coal workers had over the arrival of coal to where it needed to be to help serve the needs of the industrial economy. It's served by that, but it's also served by the absolute importance of this new energy source to making possible the capital and industrial economy. These people, these workers, had tremendous power because of it. So the coal infrastructure is concentrated, it's vulnerable to disruption over time. The coal workers know this. They use this threat of disruption as a way to win for themselves greater democratic claims. They do this through strikes where they threaten to not work, which means no coal. No coal means no industry. No industry means no comforts to the everyday masses of American people. And the industrialists and capitalists know that they need to play pool. They need to play ball with these workers and help resolve their problems so that the coal can once again flow and perform the all-important role it plays in the economy. So sabotage is when you disrupt, maybe you ruin some machinery, and of course industrialists can't stand for that very long. And it's also very difficult to know who's doing the sabotage, so your best bet is to try to avoid it. Likewise, these co-workers are constantly arguing for better pay so that their lives can be more complete and all of their needs and more of their wants can be taken care of. In the late 1800s and the 1870s, throughout the industrialized world of Europe and the United States, we see a whole series of unrest and uprisings that result in greater concessions, meaning the industrialists give in more and the working class rise up. They have they have higher levels of pay, they have shorter work weeks, they have greater democratic roles to play in the governments, they have a greater, this is the emergence of mass politics, mass political movements where everyday people can make their voices and their needs and their wants known through the political process. Formation of political parties that have to consider the needs of the working class as part of their overall decisions. So all of this adds up to a greater and higher level of democracy for the working classes throughout the developed world. Now, if this is left alone and this process is allowed to continue, you could obviously see from the industrialists and the capitalists' perspective, they're asking, well, we can't just keep letting the workers get better and better terms. What's that going to mean? Our profits are going to, if we aren't careful, disappear. So the industrialists are never ones to stand flat-footed for long, and they figure out some rather effective counter pressures that begin to take shape, particularly during the 20th century. And one of these is going to be related to oil. By the transition from a reliance upon a coal-only energy economy, by switching to oil, there's going to be some opportunity that the industrialists can turn their attention to. First, industrial management becomes a more, it's presented as like a economic science, but essentially what industrial management does is it's the management class or the industrial class begins to say, okay, workers, here's the deal. If you want more pay and you want to work fewer hours, that's fine, but what are you going to do to help us meet those requirements? There is still work that needs to be done to allow that to take place. Also, events happening in the world, wars are going to be played upon as it's the workers' patriotic duty to provide the energy sources needed by the nation, because we are at a difficult time, and if you do not help support the economy at wartime, then you are effectively aiding the enemy. Those things are used well. Your article for today does a great job discussing the Marshall Plan and how European countries, and actually in this case the United States, puts specific requirements upon those countries in Europe that are accepting American aid such that they have to do things that will ultimately help the oil economy as opposed to the coal economy, and oil will become the future of the reliance of the Western world for its economic benefits. I'm going to close by talking about just leaving this up for you.